All right. Hey, Paul, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm fine, Professor. I just happened to be stopping by your office to just see if you were in.
My office hours?
Yes, in fact, your office hours, Professor.
It's funny. No other students ever come to my office hours, and that's the truth that I think every professor can say.
Really?
It's pretty bad.
Really? Nobody comes to office? They must only come to office hours to be like, I can't hand my paper, and my paper's going to be late.
Right. They'll be like, hey, I haven't done the work, but can I still pass this course?
Right.
I get a lot of that.
Right. Do they even bother to show up to that, or do they just email you or text you now?
Yeah, that's what's happened is people will text and email. Before COVID, I used to get more, I think all of us would get more office hour visits, but now it's totally remote. Yeah.
Amazing.
And it's not even like I love my students, don't get me wrong, but let me throw them under the bus a little bit. They won't even be like, Professor Asma, Dr. Asma. It's just be like, yo, what's up? I'm like, they'll just be like, I can't be there. I'm like, I don't even know what class you're in,
Yeah,
But
right.
Anyway, that's an aside.
Oh, dear. Well, not this. Your office hours are packed. Let me tell you.
Yes.
You have everybody out there in Chinwag land stopping by.
No, we are going to have kind of a deeper dive on some topics that the Chinwag is interested in. And so office hours today is going to be witch trials you've never heard of.
Amazing. I love it. And just sort of, spanning the globe, spanning time. Well, I suppose I'll just have to listen.
You will have to just buckle up and listen to the office hours with Steve and Asma. Okay, Chinwaggers, today we are going to do this office hours on witch trials you've never heard of. Paul has me living down in the archive cellar, sleeping on a bed of nails, and I'm now going to report to you from my research on witches that you've never heard of. Everybody's heard of the Salem Witch Trial, but this is going to be 3 cases, 2 of them in England and 1 of them in the States, that I suspect you've never heard of, and they're quite important and interesting. The first one I want to start with is 1579, the Windsor Witches. And the reason why I know this is that I was doing research in a wonderful little research library called the Newberry Library in Chicago, and this thing was created in 1887. You can't actually borrow books there. You have to do the research right on the spot. But some of you will know that library because it figures very heavily in a wonderful book called Time Traveler's Wife. And this was written by a friend of mine, Audrey Niffenegger, here in Chicago. And I think there was a great movie called The Time Traveler's Wife and maybe even a show. But this library features strongly in the story. And I found a pamphlet there that, as far as I know, no one else has looked at. It's from 1579, and I will read to you a little bit from this pamphlet. It's a small coven of witches were executed in Abington, England, and this was published in London it set forth some of the important aspects of witch belief at the time. And the pamphlet is actually called, it's a mouthful, get ready, A Rehearsal Both Strange and True of Heinous and Horrible Acts Committed by Elizabeth Style, Mother Dutton, Mother Dewell, and Mother Margaret, 4 notorious witches apprehended at Windsor. And we learn that among the punishments which the Lord God hath laid upon us, for the manifest impiety and careless contempt of his word, abounding in these our desperate days, the swarms of witches and enchanters are not the last nor the least, for that old serpent Satan, suffered to be the scourge for our sins, hath of late years greatly multiplied the brood of them, and much increased their malice. Okay, that's a wonderful pamphlet language there, and very quickly, the pamphlet starts talking about how you and I, the average person, is just a hair's breadth away from being taken over and turned into witches as well, because all you need is a little too much pride or arrogance or just kind of loose morals for the Satan to smell that on you and basically to come in and then redirect you towards the evil side. And basically, we want to know what is the mischief, because it says here, marginally corrupt people could be made into servants of the demons. The witch bears the name, but the devil dispatches the deeds. Without him, the witch can continue no mischief. And what's the mischief then that the Windsor witches were into? They list 4 things. The first one is turning themselves into animals. So they were doing shape-shifting. They were accused of doing shape-shifting into creatures. And the second thing they were accused of doing was keeping black cats who they fed with their own blood. And longtime listeners of the Chinwag will remember that Paul has a black cat, and I need to ask him if he's feeding them on his own blood. Let's just keep that in mind for questions and answers down the road. 3, they're accused of killing townspeople by making effigies. So that's sort of like a little voodoo doll of wax. And then they would be sticking pins into these little voodoo dolls and thereby actually murdering people. And 4th, and this one is quite troubling for me, I don't know why, but they were accused of reversing a child's hand so that it painfully rotated to be palm side up. I don't know why that creeps me out, but it raises a common thread through all of these witch stories and then all the way up to The Exorcist of body parts rotating unnaturally. That turns out to be a theme here as you stay tuned. All right. In Windsor, Elizabeth Style was arrested first and testified against the other witches, which led to their subsequent arrest. And when the other witches were taken into custody, they used their powers to inflict revenge on Style. I mean, they were pissed off, basically. They'd been thrown under the bus, well, under the cart, I guess, in this case, and they decided to take revenge on Elizabeth Style. So Mother Duel bewitched Style so that, quote, the use of all her limbs was taken from her, and her toes did rot off her feet, and she was laid upon a barrow as a most ugly creature to behold. In less than 1 month after their arrest, the witches were executed, and I think Elizabeth Style was dead shortly after that. So that's the 1579 case, and it's interesting because it has some classic features. But now let's look at another 1591 case, and this is the case in Scotland of the Berwick witches. This one is pretty exciting because King James of Scotland, who then became King James I of England, is right at the heart of this case, and it defines witch trials for like 200 years afterwards. King James actually oversaw the torture of these witches. And this is taken from a pamphlet I found called, quote, Declaring the Damnable Life of Dr. Fion, a Notable Sorcerer Who Was Burned in Edinburgh. And the way this starts is James is actually on his way to Denmark to meet his future bride, Anne of Denmark. And the seas are so rough that the ship almost goes down and James almost dies. Then he gets Anne of Denmark, and when they're returning, he has the same trouble. The storms are just brutal. The ship almost goes down. And when he finally gets back safely, he uncovers what he thinks is a plot. This is all real. At least in his mind, it's real. He says a nobleman, a pretender to the throne, called the Earl of Bothwell, who is a real guy, cobbled together a coven of witches, including Ms. Duncan, Ms. Sampson, and the aforementioned Dr. Fion. And he basically got them to kind of try to sink the ship. So the theory is that they did some black magic and set the storm so bad against James and tried to kill him. And so he starts torturing them, and they confess to doing this. Now, I have to hasten to remind people that under torture, you might confess to anything. So let's not put too much stock in their confessions. But when they were asked, how did you do it? They said basically that they baptized a cat. Here, what is it with the cats? Again, the cats. This is one more reason why I'm a dog person. They baptized the cat, and then they attached flesh from a human, strapped it out of the cat, and then they threw the cat into the sea to drown. And this is how they created the storm, they claim. And James discovers this, and he asks them, like, why were you doing this? And they tell him, well, Satan wanted to destroy James. And he's sort of flattered by this. He thinks, well, that makes sense. I'm so virtuous. Satan would want to destroy me. And so he sort of takes a slight pride in it. But I have to point out, at this time, there's two kinds of magic. People accept the idea of natural magic, which is sometimes called white magic, and they think that there's also black magic, which is when you're using the same techniques to try to benefit yourself or aggrandize yourself. James comes along and says, you know what? I'm putting a ban on all magic. All magic is bad. There is no such thing as white magic or natural magic. And so that creates a much more hostile situation for people doing what we would call sort of indigenous medicine and this kind of thing. So James starts to torture Dr. Fion, and he uses something called the boot, which is a very ominous structure. I've seen drawings of it. It's basically like putting a giant metal boot on your foot, and then they slide wooden shims into the metal, and then a sort of a torturer pounds these down with a hammer until eventually this thing just crushes your foot and your leg. But amazingly, Dr. Fion does not confess, which is shocking because this was undoubtedly very painful. So James says, have his mouth searched. And the torturer searches his mouth and finds in Dr. Fion's mouth 2 magical pins that were apparently keeping him silent. And so once removed and the torture commences again, Dr. Fion confesses completely. Now, all of this is interesting because it has a huge influence on Shakespeare's Macbeth. James eventually becomes a patron of Shakespeare, and the Scottish play, Macbeth, actually refers to, if not the specifics, then certainly the general mood of this story of James and his witch persecution. Later in life, I'm happy to say that James seemed to relent, and he actually became kind of skeptical of witchcraft, and he saw it more like hoaxes or illusions. But who knows how many people suffered until that occurred. I want to share one more quick story. Here is an interesting story from the States. This is about 5 or 6 years before the Salem case, and this is in Boston. It's the story of Anne Goody Glover. Anne Glover was her name. Sometimes she was called Goody Glover. It was her nickname. This is 1688, and she was the last person hung in Boston for witchcraft. Most witches were thought to have like unnatural markings on their bodies, anomalies on their bodies. Bridget Bishop was a woman from the Salem case, and they said she has a 3rd nipple. And then when they searched her, it wasn't there, and they said, oh, these strange body markings move around, they disappear, they come back. So God forbid you have any strange markings on your body, you'd probably be doomed. In any case, Anne Glover was a Catholic immigrant from Ireland, and she became a washerwoman in Boston. She was escaping religious persecution, actually, by Oliver Cromwell in Ireland at the time. And she comes to the States, and she starts working for a family called the Goodwins. And the Goodwins accuse Anne of stealing laundry. At one point, she denies this, but then the Goodwin children start to act very strange. They start to have these weird behaviors, very feverish, extremely hot. At one point, they are said to be floating above the ground by a couple of inches. And so everybody knows, well, that's got to be black magic. And so suspicion falls on Anne as being possibly a witch. And now enters a very important character by the name of Cotton Mather's. You've probably heard of this guy before. Became very famous, New England theologian, Harvard man. He goes to live with the Goodwins to study the case. And eventually he writes a book about it that becomes a bestseller. And he also then becomes important in chronicling the later Salem witch trials too. So Cotton Mather's says the 4 kids would writhe and twist and contort. And he said they would do things, it wasn't epilepsy. He said it was something much weirder than that. And so here's a description that he gives very quickly. He says, sometimes they would be deaf and sometimes blind, and often all this at once. One, while their tongues would be drawn out their throats. Another, while they would be pulled out of their chins to a prodigious length. They would have their mouths opened unto such wideness that their jaws went out of joint, and anon they would clap together again with a force like that of a strong spring lock. They would make the most piteous outcries, that they were cut with knives and struck with blows that they could not bear, and their heads would twist almost around. So that's a little quote from Cotton Mather's. And again, you get the strange anatomy twisting, which is so troubling. So Mather's interviews Anne Glover, and he suggests that she's just a gullible idolater. This is sort of a typical Protestant anti-Catholic view at the time. And he asks her to say the Lord's Prayer in English, but her English isn't good enough. She speaks Gaelic. Apparently, she could recite some of the Lord's Prayer in Latin, which you think would be fairly impressive, but it really wasn't doing it for Cotton Mather. So he says she is in cahoots with the devil. And in addition, Anne Glover had these little dolls which were probably, in retrospect, Catholic saint statues, but they were interpreted to be like those little wax effigies, just witchcraft items. So she's found guilty and hanged in 1688, and a few years later is when the Salem kids start to show the same kind of weird behaviors and strange kind of twisting and writhing that then eventually leads to the Salem Witch Trials. Now, in closing, I just want to make a couple of quick points. Paul and I have talked about ergot poisoning on the show before, and this is a kind of poison that grows on rye grain when it spoils, and it basically makes the consumer of the cake or the bread trip balls. You basically get a psychedelic experience in which you start seeing all kinds of things. So one theory is that all the people that were sort of having these hallucinations might have actually had a kind of ergot poisoning. Another theory about these cases is that they're using a lot of heavy metals in their pots and pans, and so they may well have been suffering from lead poisoning. And finally, I think the one that's most compelling is the psychogenic or psychosomatic explanation. We've talked about this before, and if you have a taste for it, check out our episode on, I think, on mass panics. We talked about this. This is a kind of contagious psychosomatic symptom that you catch from just watching other people do it, and you get a lot of attention from it, but it really does make you suffer. It's not like entirely a fake thing either. Why are there so many witch scares? Why are witches scapegoats, and why do they keep coming up at all times of history? One theory is that they arise in the community when the community is especially fragile, like it's under pressure. So if you think about like frontier communities where there's sort of uncertain territorial rights, then you'll see people accusing each other of witchcraft. This happens, by the way, still in different areas in the global south. It still happens. You may remember the case in Rwanda where people went after each other as if it was a Salem witch trial in the 1990s. And in addition, economic hardships will cause people to find witches, religious tension, ethnic conflict. So we hunt out the witch as a kind of symbol or scapegoat for all our troubles, and then we torture and execute her, and thereby we think we're getting rid of our troubles. Sadly, this violence is a way that humans sort of bond together, and writer Catherine Howe sort of summarizes it well by saying, quote, "We need the witch in order to know who we are not, so that we can begin to imagine who we are." And that is a good place to wrap up this office hours with Professor Asma. I hope you enjoyed learning about some witchcraft trials you've never heard of. Go tell your friends, subscribe, go tell them to tune into the Chinwag, and we will see you next time. Wag on Weirdos. Chinwag is a production of Treefort Media and Touchy Feely Films, hosted and executive produced by Paul Giamatti and Stephen Asma. Executive producers for Treefort are Kelly Garner and Lisa Ammerman. Dan Carey is executive producer for Touchy Feely. Our series producer is Rachel Whitley Bernstein. Original theme music by Luke Topp, with additional music by Via Mardot. Oscar Guido is our executive in charge of production. Tom Monahan is head of audio for Treefort. Audio production supervision by Jared Brom and Matt Dyson. Editing and mixing by Jared Brom. Animation created by Alex Sokol. Research assistance by Aidan Brooks. Lastly, for more information, go to chinwagpod.fm and find us on Instagram or TikTok at chinwagpod or on Twitter at chinwag_pod.